Thank you, Dr. Pasquarello. We're grateful for the opportunity. And those of you who are watching will probably want to turn to Genesis chapter 12, and we'll be looking at it eventually. Now, I decided that what I would do is to share with you from start to finish, when I was asked to speak, the process I went through, the study process, the analysis process, and then on through the preaching. And so I have 4 or 5 steps that I want to follow with you. And the first one would be the invitation and the assignment. So I hope this will help new preachers for when this happens with you, when the call comes, could you speak at such and such a time for people, but also for those of us who are veterans to remind ourselves of certain aspects. So point 1 had to do with when I received the invitation and assignment, what did I do? Well, I tend now to ask a series of questions. My first question is this part of a series? And when Dr. Sweeney called me, he said we were going to be doing a series on world mission, or God's glory in the world, His redemptive mission for chapel series. And we began to talk about different texts. And Dr. Gentilette, who spoke last week, myself and Dr. Sweeney and some others were involved. And so they first asked us which text would we like to preach. Did you like to preach Isaiah, which Dr. Gentilette, of course, would like to do and did, and I would like to do. Or would you like to do Genesis 12? We were going back and forth. My point was, I don't care which passage I preach, but someone needs to preach Genesis 12 first before we go on to Isaiah, before we go on to other texts, because it's the foundational text for God's redemptive work in the world. And so Dean Sweeney had the first message, and he gave an introduction to the whole series, and then my sermon came next. So I say that so if you're on a team of ministers and you're asked to preach in some sort of rotation, or you're asked to fit into a ministry context, I think you do well to say, is this part of a series? Where would I fit into it? How would my text work? So was invited. I found out I was part of a series. I was then assigned the text, Genesis 12, 1 through 9. I knew that it was a chapel sermon. Now that helps me, having known what the assignment was, where will the assignment be carried out, and how long will I have to speak? Always good to know. When am I supposed to start? When am I supposed to stop? What's the setting? Well, I knew then that my audience would be the Beeson Divinity School faculty, staff, and students. Though they then explained to me, because of COVID, it would be a smaller group, and that there would be people in overflow rooms, which I suppose is the only way that when I preach that there's ever anyone in an overflow room, is when they have to limit the number of people in the actual building. But I knew then too that we really, like most Sunday morning church services, they really want you to stop at noon because we have community lunch. And then after that, of course, classes and things. So I began to understand, as I have before, my role. What was I supposed to do? I was part of a series. I was supposed to preach Genesis 12 after the introduction as a foundational passage to this series. I was going to preach not to a general audience and not to an audience of all ages, but rather, frankly, to all adults, that is, students, staff, and friends of Beeson Divinity School. There were no teenagers there. I did not expect any. There were no children there. I did not expect any. But I say that so that you will realize the importance of knowing who's going to be in the room, what the level's going to be, and how you might then make your preparations. Then I did something else. I checked my own schedule so that I would have some idea of how busy I was going to be at that point in time when I was going to come and speak. So I realized that this was about the second week of the semester. Things would be running pretty hard. I would have lots of things to do. So this led me then to try to do some work ahead of time, knowing, though, that some of the work would have to be done 48 hours or less before. But I I just encourage you to take that sort of look at your schedule so that you won't say something like, I heard a man say one time, he said, "I'm not very prepared. How would I have known 5 years ago when I accepted this invitation that I would be so busy the night before?" So take a look at your schedule, make a plan, and see if it fits. So that's the first. What's the assignment? Where do I deliver it? How long do I have to speak? Who will be there? And what is my schedule? So that's just the basic assignment. Then my second part of my process was to consider the text, at least briefly. Now, I was given Genesis 12, 1 through 9. This is a text that's very familiar to me because I have taught survey of the Old Testament theology, Pentateuch, and other related courses for years on end now. And Genesis 12, 1 through 9 is one of those anchoring texts. As one scholar put it, there are two sections to the Old Testament. That is, Genesis 12 and the rest of it. It's so foundational that you need to see its importance. But I reminded myself that it's very familiar to me. And if I'm not careful, I won't go back over it and get the particulars and the details and try to present it as if for the first time to people who will be listening. I noted how important it is for biblical theology. That is, when God promises Abraham that he will have descendants, that they will have a land, that they will be a blessing to all nations, that this is one of the linchpin texts in biblical theology. The significance of that for me was that if I wasn't careful, I would have way too many things on my plate, on my outline. I needed to make some choices. Because if you have a text that you could connect the whole Bible to, then you have to make some decisions. So I was taking mental notes of this. I noted that there's a very controversial bit about the land in chapter 12 and verse 7, that remains a very contested issue in the ancient Near East. And if you listen to my sermon, you'll see that I basically skipped that issue altogether. I noted for the first time how this text, like so many, they're on an arc toward worship with God. All these things going on, but how it ends is in worship. So we're headed toward communion. So that was my preliminary thought about the text to orient myself, having received the assignment. The third part of my process was to think about our current times. I knew I'd be preaching in September 2020. I took a look at what was going on in the country at the time of my assignment, and as part of what Dr. Sweeney wanted done, we have been thinking about justice and race issues being very prominent in the country. We were concerned about insecurity in people's lives, and I think this text has a lot of potential for helping people commit in uncertain times. And so I was just trying to consider also those things, but also that's the start of a semester. It's a time of hope, it's a time of energy, and thus a time of joy, but also time for warning. So I'm just trying to think my way about these things, to orient myself into what I was going to need to do. So fourth then, I want to share with you the process of study that I do every week when I teach in a church. I'm currently speaking through the Gospel of Luke. But when I'm preaching a once-off time like this, one text as opposed to a sermon series, the first thing I'll do in the Old Testament is translate and read the passage several times. The reason I translate is not just because that I value Hebrew and because I can and because I want to set a good model for our students, but because it makes me slow down, look at the words, learn my way through it, see what the structure has, and to just soak in the text. I then decided to remind myself of all the connections of this passage in Genesis, chapters 12 to 25. And then I went to the commentaries. I usually start with a Tyndale Old Testament commentary. The way my mind works, I start with the simplest that I can. That gives me the basics, outlined, and details. As I always tell students, the Tyndale Old and New Testament commentary series are basic commentaries. They will keep you from being embarrassed in public if you will look at them and pay attention to them. So you start with that basic line. But this time, I decided that since I have two colleagues, Dr. Ross and Dr. Matthews, who are considerable Genesis scholars. They're also Psalms and Isaiah scholars, actually. But because they're considerable Genesis scholars, I read Ross's commentary, which gives you the basics and then the structure of a sermon outline on Genesis. And then I read Ken Matthews' exposition and analysis of it in the New American Commentary. So they were teaching me what some of these words mean, what some of these phrases mean, reminding me of passages or instructing me in passages where there were connections. So that's what I usually do. I'll start with a simpler commentary, then I'll move up to something like the New International Commentary of the Old Testament or the New American Commentary, and then I conclude with a Hebrew text-based commentary. In this case, I read Klaus Westermann's commentary on Genesis. And I had not looked at Westermann for quite a while, but it was very enriching because of the work that he did, helping me understand the context of the patriarch Abraham and what worship was like there in contrast to worship in a temple or some later time. Some people start with the language and go to the simpler. I tend to start with the simpler and go to the more complex. By this time, I will have formed an outline of the passage, what I want to emphasize, and will begin to understand some of the illustrations and applications I want to make. Now, I want to stop for a moment and say, if I went too fast over that commentary list, all of you should write the appropriate office at Beeson Divinity School to get the list of recommended commentaries by the faculty, and they are listed by their level of complexity, like I just did. So if it's a basic, we have a note for that. If it's more involved, we have a note for that. If it's for scholars only, we have a note for that. Since I have my workers here, do you know where they could get such a thing? Well, I think so, because it was compiled by Isaiah Cruz last spring, and I have seen it, and it's an excellent resource. And I think the Preaching Institute followers would love to have it if they don't already. So that was my process of study, and now I have an outline, what I want to emphasize and to illustrate. And so now we're to stage 5, which is execution. And I want to now come to the text of Genesis and tell you how we were thinking. Now, as I began to think about exactly how to structure Genesis 12 and things, I recalled that I was part of a worship service in which the sermon is not the whole thing. I was asked for input on hymns and on prayers and on other scripture readings. So we're going to have an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, and a pulpit or a sermon text. I chose, if you have your text, your Bible with you, look at Joshua 24. Now you say that's an odd place to start for Genesis 12, but Genesis 12 is about Abram and Sarah following God's call in their life. Joshua 24 verses 2 and 3 actually precede that Genesis 12 experience. It's kind of an offhand comment that Joshua makes as he's giving his farewell speech to the Israelites in about 1400 BC, 600 years after Abram. But he gathers them all in 24:1, and in verse 2, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many." And it goes on with the promises. So I ask that this text be read as the Old Testament reading so that I could start with the fact in Genesis 11 and 12 that God was calling converted people. So my first point was to highlight Abram's conversion in Joshua 24, 2 and 3. And so in Genesis 11, when you have the genealogy of Terah, Abram's father, and then it leads into chapter 12, I wanted the people to know that these were converted people who had used to serve other gods, but now, because of the intervention of God in their lives, they were serving the true and living God that Genesis 1 through 11 had emphasized as the creator of all men and women and of everything in heaven and earth. Because when we get to Genesis 12, we have the beginning of a covenant. And in the Bible, covenants always govern a relationship. They do not create them. So God knew this couple, Abram and Sarah. They were His people. And as they knew one another, in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, as I was making my structure, my outline now, following that conversion, we have the calling of a couple. I emphasize that this was Abram and Sarah, and that God, faced with a worldwide sin problem in Genesis 1 through 11, starts extremely small, indeed with one single couple, a man and a woman. And that these are people who know Him, but when God calls Abram and Sarah goes, they both go. And so I just wanted to stress that it was a family decision when the family was just a couple. As I got feedback on the sermon afterwards, I had at least a couple of people thank me for including Sarah in this. Because often Abram's mentioned and Sarah comes along when she's causing a problem. It's important for us to see that they're both involved in this activity, that God has called a couple. The next thing I saw was in Genesis 12:3, where God says He's going to make them a blessing to all nations, which in the Old Testament means peoples. It does not mean a geopolitical regional entity. A nation, the word's usually translated it is a people group. So currently, that there are no Israelites, there are no Jewish people. We have Abram and Sarah. And they are to establish a people group. They are to establish a family, which according to 12:3 is a family to bless all other families. So that from their family, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. And as you follow that trail of cited passages throughout the Old Testament and into the New, you find that the Jewish people, the family of Jesus of Nazareth, will bless all the peoples of the world through Jesus of Nazareth, through salvation in Him. But it starts as a family for other families. Now, because of the time period I was giving the sermon in, as I've already mentioned, with an emphasis on justice and equality and so forth in our culture currently, I then decided to show that in Genesis 17, where the covenant is actually sealed through the practice of circumcision. And I looked in chapter 17 and showed the people there that at this point in time, remember, there's still no son for Abraham and Sarah. It's still this couple, a family in waiting to bless all the families of the world. But the covenant begins at this point with Abram and all the men of their household. Therefore, the people who enter into this covenant with Abraham, with God, are by definition it is by definition a multi-racial, multicultural entity. That God's work with Abraham from the start, a family to bless all the other families, was never solely a Jewish thing, nor solely a Gentile thing, but an interracial, interfamily kind of situation. And upon, again, some feedback I got in the sermon, was from a friend who is of Chinese background, and said he appreciated the fact that we stressed that from the start, God's redemptive project was multi-ethnic. And so I say that not to say, didn't I do a great job, but to say I wouldn't have thought about that. I wouldn't have thought about how that would have affected someone who was listening any more than I would have the addition of Sarah at that point. So sometimes when you just tell the story as it unfolds, we find out that God's very inclusive in His work. We find these things out because we don't have to put them in the text, they're in the text. And because of the emphasis on justice and righteousness, I made one other connection to this promise, this covenant, and that was Genesis 18. Where, again, in a passage that we might not be looking for something like this, it's a passage about God deciding to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. And in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 18, God says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, seeing that Abram shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed in him?" So there's a promise. "For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." From the beginning, this family for all families was multiracial, and it was anchored in the promise of righteousness and justice. So, a lot of the concerns that we have as normal human beings have already been addressed in the covenant structure that God's putting here in the Abraham covenant and then all the way through the Bible. So I just wanted to make that point. I didn't do that topically. I did it where the part about all nations being blessed was repeated. So I was just following the textual uses with my mind on what some of the interests and problems that people were facing. So the last thing I did was to go back, as we've seen this conversion, this calling of a couple, this family for all families, this family for justice and acts of righteousness. It concluded with Abraham worshiping God in chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. That's always the trajectory. Relationship with God, communion with God, and this is how it is. Now, this is where Westermann was very interesting, because he described to me, and I didn't really put this in the sermon, but I mentioned this because it enriched me, whether or not I gave it out as a preacher or not, because he talked about how close to the ground, how close to creation that Abram was, and how he came to see that God met him on the ground in real life in the kind of situations that a nomadic, large household of shepherds and stockmen and women would have. That is, he met them where they were, and Abram built an altar to show that this is where he met God, and that if you come here, it's a witness of God, and that if he came back, it would be a testimony of God. So, I've been thinking in the last few years about why it is human beings feel the presence of God so much in nature and creation, and how some people, depending on their sensibilities, and not just when they're being contrary, but they actually feel closer to God in a situation like that than they do in even a reasonable church. So it was helping me to see that God has already, He has given us texts that help us understand that, help us embrace that, and find communion with God, not just with our sense of feeling or enjoyment, but to really meet with God in nature, and to help me pastorally to understand some friends of mine who actually prefer that kind of experience. They must make themselves do the other, whereas a lot of us must make ourselves find God in creation. So that was very helpful for me, but as I preached it, I just wanted to stress that all of us, we are headed toward communion with God as we follow Him covenantally. And that is the arc of preaching and teaching, is always to bring people to God. So, I've spoken very quickly, I suppose, but I ended up with a 5-point sermon, which is fine as long as you don't want extra time for those other 2 points. But there was still a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if I recall correctly, we also had as a New Testament reading Hebrews 11. That you could do worse than that even if we didn't do it that day, which was to show how the New Testament is showing that Abram and Sarah were people of faith, following God, covenantally connected for communion with Him. And so I kind of do this kind of process every week when I teach a group of adults. I still try to say, what is my job? How does it fit? Who's going to be listening? And how will this passage fit into their lives? But then let the text itself do the work. Because what I find is the text has plenty for us. We don't have to insert things in there. As we let the text speak, we will find what we need.
Thank you, Dr. House. Friends, if you're watching and you'd like to raise a question or make a comment, my email address is on the board, and I have one question that's come in. Let me find it here for you, Dr. House, and I'm going to share it with you. It's about your preparation. This writer says, your preparation assumes much familiarity with the text, such that you could determine possible applications before your study. When it's a less familiar passage, how do you prepare to study without making the text say what you want so that it applies like you think it should?
Yeah, but by now, again, by now, I am self-aware enough to know that I can realize, given the group I'm talking to, if I know them, like I know the Beeson community or like I know this group of adults, I can anticipate, I know what's going on in their lives. Part of my job is to let the text speak and only speak about, say, of the 15 possibilities that I know about that would help them in their lives. It's these 3 that the text brings out, or these 2, or something that I hadn't thought of. I still let the text do it, but I think we're not doing our best work if we act like we don't know the audience. I think that's also a form of dishonesty. And if I don't do that, then I'm just as likely to refuse to do what the text says or to avoid it. Now, if you don't know the people, so you're asked to go, or I am, if I'm asked to go speak somewhere where I don't know the people, I don't know the church, I don't know the college, I don't know anything about it, I ask a series of questions that will at least get me clued in. Give me the age range of the people who will be in there. Give me an idea of what the people do for a living. And so you would probably have as good a list as I would at that point. You want to ask a set of 5 or 6 questions that will get you in the right frame of mind so that you don't preach a youth evangelism sermon to a group of senior adults somewhere. Does that make, you might add to that better than I would.
Well, no, that's good, and I do the same thing. This writer, too, wants to know if the passage is not familiar, not just the people. So I'm a pastor, and I'm going to preach, say, from one of the minor prophets, and I've never preached from that book in the Old Testament, and it's totally new to me. What would you do?
Yeah, and those, again, I'm going to ask how much time I have. I'm going to ask all those questions. When is this coming up? If it's next week or next month or next year. How unfamiliar I am with it and so forth. Now, this is why, again, I would say when you have a good study Bible with a good introduction to orient you, not tell you what to think, but to tell you what you better not be thinking because it's dead wrong. So, orient you. That's why why I mentioned the Tyndale Old Testament commentary or something very basic to give you, here are the times, here's the structure of the passage, here's what's going on, so that you don't misinterpret or misread it for yourself. And then if I couldn't translate it from Hebrew to slow me down and make me do it, I would say the more times you read the whole book, so if it's Amos, the more time you read those 9 chapters, and then at least 20 or 30 times this passage, then you become familiar with it and with the rhythms. But if you got to do that in 3 days, that's tougher.
Let me follow up on that, and that relates to the use of the commentary, and you are an author of very fine commentaries. There are some of us who teach preaching who tell our students, don't look at the commentary until you've already done your exegetical work. But you follow a process where you said you went to the Tyndale as a baseline to begin. Talk a little bit about how commentaries may work in helping us preach, yet still allowing us room to do our own work.
Well, I can tell you, given your example, like it's an unfamiliar text, a minor prophets text, they can't do exegesis without help. They can read words and they can get general impressions. They can know whether it's a sin, a judgment, a renewal passage, and that's a great start. But commentaries never tell you what to preach anyway because they don't know your audience. They don't know your setting, your situation. But a good basic commentary or study Bible will keep you from making mistakes, will orient your mind. And then I'd say once you kind of know what's going on, once you're in the framework, yeah, do your best work. And again, that's why I'd say read it over and over again. But to act like somebody can do exegesis of a passage when they don't have a clue as to what's going on, they need a little help before that.
Well, I would say amen to that, and that's quite humbling at the same time, isn't it? That we're part of an ongoing conversation across the centuries.
Well, yeah, that's right. And I've been preaching through Luke. I have really needed the help.
Yeah.
I'm a New Testament Christian in that my whole Bible usually is the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And when I get asked to preach somewhere, it's nearly always, will you do an Old Testament text?
Mm-hmm.
So I decided 2 or 3 years ago I would teach through Luke.
Yeah.
But that meant I follow the same process. I have people who teach me the basics so I don't misread a parable horribly, so that I don't treat a New Testament Greek text like it was a Hebrew text and so forth. I need the help. I couldn't really do except the most basic, superficial work without a little bit of help. But again, if you go to the commentaries to tell you what your sermon ought to look like, that's a huge mistake. They're going to keep you from misreading the text. Mm-hmm. They may help you with the structure of the passage, which should then be your sermon outline. But still, you have so much work to do beyond that they weren't written to do that for you.
Yes. Here's a question that follows up on when you were talking about the large sweep or scope of the promise to Abraham. In his John Calvin, in his wonderful commentary on Genesis 12, says, this is the beginning of the church.
Yeah.
The birth of the church is the call of Abraham and Sarah in light of the whole counsel of God. Would you comment on that a little bit?
I think that's right, because Genesis 12 is an intervention text, I say to students now, because the whole sweep of human history before 2000 BC gets summarized in 11 chapters. And we're going to enter in at 2000 BC, and we know that minimum we have recorded Egyptian texts that are 1,500 to 2,000 years older than that. This is an intervention text. This is God's working of his redemption in human history. And so, yes, the Abraham's family then becomes the means by which God reaches out to all the other families. And I always remind students that when Jesus instituted the new covenant in his blood, On the Lord's Supper, Luke 22:20, there was not a Gentile in the room. Paul's exactly right in Romans 9-11. You Gentiles need to remember you got this from this family and received it as a gift.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think the church begins there because the church is the called out ones of God, which is what Abram was, as opposed to saying, well, there's no church until the New Testament.
You mentioned that, our last question, and I'll let you go. You mentioned that Hebrews 11 was the New Testament reading. Richard Hayes has an interesting book, Reading Scripture Backwards. And would you begin with the New Testament text, say Hebrews 11, and read backwards to Genesis to get a fix on what's going on?
Yeah, I think what I think Chip Hayes would say, being honestly, and I'd be honest the other direction. He knows the New Testament better than he does the Old Testament, so he reads backwards, and I know the Old Testament better than I know the New Testament, so I read backwards. I read forwards.
Yeah.
And I think both of us would say, when he gets far enough back, he says, I'm starting to lose what's actually in this. If I go far enough forward, I might have the same problem. So I guess I do both because I'm still trying to figure out the context of some New Testament passages.
Yeah.
And I have to work back. I wouldn't even think to ask the question unless I got here. So my goal is, as a lifelong Bible reader, having a daily Bible reading time for 50 years now, is to learn to go both directions with that as needed.
Yeah.
So I would say if you can only go back, or you can only go for do it. But I think he's right to say yes, because I think the Bible's a unity, and I think that that's anchored in God's unified person.
Yeah.
And so, as I say to my students now, it's not an if it's a unity question, given what Jesus says about the Bible. It's a how question.
Yeah. So
I may figure it out or not, but I use people like Hayes and others who are saying, here's what they're hearing or seeing as they read. Mm-hmm. And then you test it out. And all of us who write books and preach, we're just trying to do it better the next time.
Yeah. Well, that's extremely helpful. Well, Dr. House, thank you for joining us today and sharing from your experience and your wisdom. I've learned a lot. I'm sure Joy has too, and our listeners. We're glad that you joined us. We thank you for being with us for the Text to Sermon events this year. This fall semester will pick up again in the spring during the month of February, and we hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.